I'm Randall Holcombe. We're talking about some basic ideas of public choice, economic analysis of political decision making. What I want to do in this segment is talk about the Coase Theorem and apply that to political decision making. Now, the Coase Theorem says, in the absence of transaction costs, the allocation of resources is independent of the assignment of property rights. Wow, that sounds pretty complicated. Another way to state it is, in the absence of transaction costs, resources are allocated to their highest valued use. Let me explain the common sense of that, because it really makes more sense when we see how it works. Starting with the beginning, and the absence of transaction costs. Transaction costs are anything that stand in the way of mutually advantageous exchange. So when we say in the absence of transaction costs, we mean nothing is standing in the way of people making bargains if there's a mutual advantage to doing so. So in the absence of transaction costs, nothing standing in the way of people making bargains, resources are allocated to their highest valued use. And the common sense of that is whoever something is worth the most to will buy it if there are no transaction costs that prevent that from happening. So when we apply the Coase Theorem to markets, well, what it's saying is resources will be allocated to their highest valued use as long as there aren't transaction costs that stand in the way of a bargain being made. Now, let's apply that concept of the Coase Theorem to political decision making. In political decision making, there are a few people who face low transaction costs who bargain with each other to make public policy. So we have people in the legislature, they're the nucleus of this low transaction cost group. They engage in political exchange, in log rolling, they trade votes in order to bargain to create public policy. They face low transaction costs. There are small numbers of these people. They all know each other. They can bargain with each other. And also included in that low transaction cost group are lobbyists, other people who have political connections. If we want to be a little bit cynical about them, we might call them cronies. These are people who engage in political bargaining to produce public policy. Because they know each other, because they can bargain with each other, they find themselves in a low transaction cost group, so they can bargain to make public policy that is the highest valued policy to themselves, right? In the absence of transaction costs, resources are allocated to the highest valued use, but they're allocated to the highest valued use of the people who are in the bargaining group, in the low transaction cost group. Now, one of the things that Coase was writing about when he developed the Coase Theorem was externalities, that is, costs that economic activity places on third parties. And the reason why those externalities are a problem is the third parties who bear the costs, they face high transaction costs, so they can't bargain to allocate resources efficiently. Now, let's apply that idea of externalities to government decision making. We have a low transaction cost group of legislators, of lobbyists, of other people who are well connected. They bargain with each other to produce policies that are of the highest value to themselves. But the bulk of people find themselves facing high transaction costs. Ordinary citizens, people like me, I can't bargain with the legislature in order to produce public policy. And so I find myself, most people find themselves in a high transaction cost group where they have no power to make public policy. So there's a political externality that is created. The people in the low transaction cost group, the legislators, the lobbyists, the policymakers, they make policies that are in the best interest for themselves. But often when doing so, they place costs on people in the high transaction cost group. Government policies, when the government produces policies, they apply to everybody. So people in the low transaction cost group, the legislators, the lobbyists, they produce policies that are in their best interest, but that often impose costs on the bulk of the population, the majority. So that's the Coase Theorem applied to political decision making. Now, there's a certain common sense behind this that's been around for a long time. Some of you might be familiar with the Occupy Wall Street movement that occurred originally in the United States and spread somewhat around the world in 2010. This was after the recession and the housing policies that bailed out the Wall Street bankers but left a lot of homeowners homeless, that they were kicked out of their homes because they couldn't pay their mortgages. Now, what the Occupy Wall Street people were talking about is policies that benefit the 1% at the expense of the 99%. So let's think about that in terms of the Coase Theorem. The 1%, those are the people in the low transaction cost group. Those are the legislators, the lobbyists, the cronies, the people who have political connections. The 99%, those are the people in the high transaction cost group. They don't have the political connections so that they can have a direct input into making public policy. In other social sciences outside of economics, in political science, in sociology, there is a long-standing tradition of what's called elite theory, the elites and the masses. The idea is that the elites, those are the people who make the public policies. The masses, those are the people who have to work under the public policies that are passed by the elite. So if we go back to the Coase Theorem, we can see that there's a certain logic to the Occupy Wall Street movement, the idea that policies are made for the benefit of the 1% at the expense of the 99%. We see that there's an economic logic to elite theory. It's the elites who make policy, often imposing costs on the masses. The elites are the low transaction cost group. They're the people the Coase Theorem says are able to bargain to produce policies that are of the highest value to themselves. But in democratic decision making, where the policies that the elites, the low transaction cost group, the policies they make apply to everybody, they're able to impose costs on the 99%, on the masses, on the people in the high transaction cost group. So the Coase Theorem applied to politics gives us a lot of insight into why it is that public policy often seems to benefit a favored few at the expense of most of us.